The massive starship Epsilon hung in the void of space, its hull gleaming with a soft metallic sheen. J. Park leaned against the reinforced observation window, his breath creating a small fog patch against the thick glass. Outside, the endless darkness of space seemed to pulse with an uneasy anticipation. Alarms chirped softly in the background. The Zentari fleet was approaching, and everyone knew this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. Epsilon 9 colony had been preparing for years, building defenses that looked almost primitive, but concealed layers of technological complexity that would make most advanced civilizations scratch their heads. Seok Won, the colony's chief communications officer, turned from his console. "They're broadcasting an official communication," he called out, his fingers dancing across holographic displays that flickered with streams of data. Jay watched as the first Zentari ships emerged from hyperspace. They were massive, organic-looking vessels that seemed to breathe and pulse with an alien intelligence. Their design was nothing like human spacecraft, all curved edges and pulsing biometallic surfaces that looked more like living creatures than machines. The colony's defense systems hummed to life. Underground battery arrays, camouflaged beneath what looked like simple agricultural terrain, began charging. Satellite networks, disguised as weather monitoring systems, repositioned themselves with surgical precision. "They think we're just another backwater human colony," Jay muttered to himself, a slight smile playing on his lips. The Zentari communication came through, a series of complex tonal frequencies that would sound like random noise to an untrained ear. But Seok Won was anything but untrained. His specialized translation algorithms began decoding the message, revealing a typical alien ultimatum: surrender, submit, become part of the Zentari collective. Humans had heard this speech before. In the HFY underground command center, holographic displays showed the incoming fleet. Tactical teams moved with practiced efficiency. Young technicians who looked more like university students than military personnel manipulated complex systems with casual expertise. What the Zentari didn't know was that Epsilon 9 was more than just a colony. It was a prototype, a testing ground for humanity's most advanced defensive technologies. Every seemingly innocent piece of infrastructure had multiple hidden purposes. The agricultural domes, massive electromagnetic pulse generators, the research greenhouses, camouflaged weapon platforms, the water purification systems, advanced sensor networks that could track molecular movements across kilometers. Jay watched as the first Zentari scout ships began their approach. They moved with a predatory grace, expecting minimal resistance. Their previous encounters with human colonies had been swift and decisive. Technological superiority always won, but this time was different. "Incoming transmission," Seok Won announced, his voice calm. "They're demanding immediate surrender." Jay chuckled. "Tell them we're thinking about it." The colony's defense systems were like an iceberg, 90% hidden, waiting to reveal themselves at the perfect moment. Quantum-entangled communication networks, adaptive AI systems, and weapons that could reconfigure themselves faster than an enemy could compute. Outside, space itself seemed to hold its breath. The Zentari ships continued their approach, massive and seemingly invincible. Their biometallic hulls gleamed with technologies developed over millennia of galactic conquest. They had subjugated hundreds of civilizations, crushed countless rebellions. They had never met humans like these. J. Park adjusted his simple military jacket, watching the incoming fleet. No dramatic speeches, no grand gestures, just quiet, calculated, preparation. The first shot would determine everything, and humanity was definitely going to take the first shot. End of part 1. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? The research lab buzzed with an electric intensity. Hee-Soo. Kim stood at the center of a holographic storm, her fingers dancing across multiple projection interfaces. Scattered around her were fragments of Zentari technology, pieces captured during the initial contact moments ago. Most scientists would have been intimidated. Hee-Soo looked like she was planning a university project. Quantum processors hummed. Beneath reinforced lab tables, advanced cooling systems kept the temperature precisely controlled, preventing any potential technological meltdown. Each machine looked deceptively simple, but contained layers of complexity that would make most alien engineers weep. We've got approximately 47 minutes before they realize we're actively analyzing their communication protocols, she muttered to her assistant, Minho. Minho's fingers were already racing across another interface, running parallel decryption algorithms. The Zentari communication systems were complex, biological-technological hybrids that used quantum entanglement for data transmission. But humans had been studying these systems for decades. What the Zentari didn't understand was humanity's unique approach to technological adaptation. Where most species would take years to reverse engineer alien tech, humans could do it in hours. A holographic representation of the Zentari communication matrix began taking shape. Intricate networks of data streams, pulsing with strange bioelectric signatures, started revealing their secrets. Hisu's specialized AI systems were literally tearing apart the alien technology's DNA. Look at this, she pointed to a specific data stream. Their entire communication network has a fundamental weakness in its quantum encryption. One small manipulation, and we can basically read their entire tactical communication. Minho whistled softly. They have no idea what's coming. Outside the lab, the colony's defense systems continued their silent preparation. What looked like ordinary agricultural equipment began subtly repositioning. Satellite networks that seemed dormant suddenly came alive with microscopic adjustments. The key Zentari ships continued their approach, completely unaware that their most sensitive systems were being systematically dismantled. Hisu pulled up another holographic display. Captured Zentari weapon fragments lay suspended in a quantum stabilization field. Most researchers would treat these with extreme caution. She was already planning how to turn them into something entirely new. Their energy distribution systems are fascinating, she explained to Minho. They use a biological crystalline hybrid that can adapt to different energy spectrums, but it has a fundamental resonance frequency that we can exploit. Within minutes, she had developed a preliminary counter-frequency that could potentially disable entire sections of Zentari weaponry. The lab was a symphony of technological innovation. Holographic models shifted and changed, revealing potential. Technological vulnerabilities. Complex algorithms danced across screens, breaking down alien systems faster than their creators could have imagined possible. Prepare the quantum transmission buffer, Hisu instructed. We're going to send them. A little surprise? Minho grinned. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy for being unpredictable, but few truly understood how deep that unpredictability went. The first wave of technological countermeasures was about to be unleashed. The Zentari thought they were coming to conquer a simple human colony. They were walking into a technological buzzsaw. End of part 2. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? The communication center felt different today. Sungmin Lee wasn't just a communications officer. He was about to become a psychological warfare maestro. The Zentari didn't realize they were about to face something far more complex than traditional military strategy. Holographic screens flickered with intercepted Zentari transmissions. Each message was a potential weapon, each frequency a potential vulnerability. Sungmin's team had been training for this moment their entire careers, understanding that in modern galactic conflicts, information was the most powerful weapon. We're not just going to respond, Sungmin explained to his team. We're going to make them question everything they know about us. The Zentari communication network was hierarchical and rigid. They operated on strict protocols, with each transmission carefully vetted through multiple command layers. This was their greatest weakness. Humans, in contrast, were chaos incarnate. Sungmin began constructing a series of strategic misinformation packages. They weren't simple lies, but carefully crafted psychological triggers designed to create maximum confusion. Each transmission would contain layers of seemingly contradictory information that would force the Zentari command structure to second-guess every decision. One transmission suggested the colony had advanced defensive capabilities. Another implied complete vulnerability. A third hinted at potential internal conflicts. The goal wasn't to convince the Zentari of any single narrative, but to create a state of perpetual uncertainty. "Watch this," he told his junior communications specialist Jiwoo. The first wave of transmissions began. They used the Zentari's own communication protocols against them, embedding micro-signals that would trigger deep-seated psychological responses. Decades of studying alien psychology had taught humans the art of strategic manipulation. In the Zentari command ship, confusion began to spread. Their communication officers started receiving conflicting reports. A sensor reading suggested massive weapon concentrations. The next moment, it showed complete defensive vulnerability. Tactical maps shifted inexplicably. Command structures became paralyzed with indecision. What made humans truly dangerous wasn't their technology. It was their ability to think beyond traditional strategic frameworks. "They're trying to understand our logic," Sungmin whispered. "But we don't have a logic they can comprehend." Each transmission was a psychological puzzle. Some contained fragments of truth, others were elaborate fabrications. The Zentari artificial intelligence systems began to crash, unable to process the complexity of human communication strategies. Outside, the colony appeared calm. Agricultural domes continued their peaceful rotation. Satellite networks maintained their seemingly innocent positions. Nothing suggested the massive psychological warfare being waged through invisible communication channels. Jiwoo watched in amazement as Zentari communication networks began to destabilize. "How are we doing this?" Sungmin smiled. "We're not fighting their technology. We're fighting their mind." The Zentari had conquered hundreds of civilizations using straightforward military might. They understood strength, understood submission. But they had never encountered a species that could weaponize uncertainty itself. Tactical maps in the Zentari command ship began to malfunction. Coordination between different fleet sections became impossible. What should have been a simple invasion was turning into a nightmare of miscommunication. Sungmin knew they were winning, not through firepower, but through the most human weapon of all, unpredictability. "Prepare the next transmission sequence," he instructed. "Let's make them really uncomfortable." The psychological breakthrough was complete. The Zentari were no longer an invading force. They were a confused, fragmented group, second-guessing every single decision. Humans had turned information itself into a weapon. End of Part 3. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? The galaxy had long been a place of silent oppression. Countless species lived under the Zentari's brutal regime, their hopes crushed beneath layers of technological suppression and economic control. Yuna Choi understood this better than most. Her communication network wasn't just a communication system. It was a lifeline of hope. Hidden quantum communication relays, disguised as ordinary deep space transmission arrays, began pulsing with a unique frequency. Each signal carried more than just information. It carried a promise of resistance. The first response came from the Kralvin, a silicon-based species that had been enslaved by the Zentari for generations. Their communication was initially hesitant, like a wounded animal testing a potential ally. "We've been watching your colony," their transmission read. "No species has ever resisted the Zentari like this." Yuna knew this was more than a simple communication. This was an invitation to something bigger. Her team had spent years building these hidden networks. What looked like simple communication arrays were actually sophisticated resistance platforms. Each relay point could transmit encrypted messages across multiple dimensional frequencies, making them virtually undetectable. The Zentari had a critical weakness they never understood. They believed in absolute control. But resistance wasn't about military might. It was about connection. More responses began flooding in. The Moldar mining colonies, long oppressed and considered technologically inferior. The floating cloud civilizations of the Nexus cluster, even the traditionally neutral Quantum Harmonics Council, was showing interest. "We need a unified communication protocol," Yuna told her team. "Something that can connect these isolated resistance groups." What emerged wasn't just a communication network. It was a living, breathing resistance organism. Each species contributed something unique. The Kralvin provided advanced stealth technologies. The Moldar shared intricate knowledge of Zentari supply routes. The cloud civilizations offered complex, atmospheric interference techniques. Humans were the connective tissue, the strategists who could see the larger picture. Holographic maps began lighting up. What had been isolated pockets of potential resistance were now becoming a coordinated network. Supply routes, communication channels, strategic information, everything was being shared in real time. The Zentari had always believed in divide and conquer. They never imagined someone might unite the conquered. Yuna's communication center looked like organized chaos. Multiple holographic displays showed different species' communication patterns. Advanced translation algorithms worked over time, converting complex linguistic structures into understandable strategic information. "They're sharing everything," her assistant remarked. "Technologies, survival strategies, resistance techniques." Yuna knew this was more than a military alliance. This was hope becoming a tangible force. Each transmission carried a simple message: you are not alone. The Zentari monitoring systems, already destabilized by previous psychological warfare, couldn't comprehend the complexity of what was happening. Their rigid hierarchical understanding couldn't process this organic, fluid resistance network. Resistance was no longer about individual survival. It was about collective transformation. Small resistance cells that had existed in isolation for generations suddenly found themselves part of something larger. Technologies were shared, strategies were developed, a collective consciousness began to emerge, not through force but through genuine connection. Humans had always been good at building bridges. Now they were building a galactic resistance. The communication network pulsed with energy. What the Zentari saw as separate, isolated species were now becoming a unified force. The revolution had begun, and it started with a simple message: we stand together. End of part 4. Would you like me to continue with the final part of the story? The void of space crackled with tension. Ji-won Park stood on the command deck, his eyes reflecting the holographic battle projections. This wasn't just a battle. This was humanity's statement to the galaxy. Hundreds of spacecraft filled the space around Epsilon 9. They weren't uniformly designed. Each vessel represented a different species united under a single goal: sleek human. Interceptors flew alongside crystalline Kralvin battle platforms and the ethereal cloud ships of the Nexus cluster. The Zentari fleet approached, massive and imposing. Their ships looked like living organisms, pulsing biometallic structures that had conquered civilizations for millennia. They expected another easy victory. They were wrong. "Activation sequence initiated," Ji-won announced calmly. The first wave of attacks came not from weapons, but from complex quantum disruption signals. Developed by human engineers, these signals targeted the Zentari ship's biological-technological interfaces. Entire weapon systems began shutting down mid-approach. Zentari commanders watched in horror as their supposedly invincible fleet started experiencing systematic failures. Communication networks collapsed. Weapon systems became unreliable. Navigation computers began producing random, nonsensical coordinates. What made human technology terrifying was its adaptability. Each allied species contributed something unique. The Moldar mining colonies provided advanced electromagnetic pulse technologies. The cloud civilizations of Nexus created atmospheric interference that scrambled alien sensor systems. Humans provided the strategic coordination that transformed these individual capabilities into a unified force. "Target their primary command ships," Ji-won instructed. Precision wasn't about raw firepower. It was about understanding the enemy's fundamental weaknesses. The human-led fleet moved with a fluidity that defied traditional military doctrine. Ships repositioned in milliseconds, using quantum communication networks that allowed instantaneous tactical adjustments. Where Zentari ships moved in rigid formations, the resistance fleet moved like a living organism. Massive energy weapons that would have obliterated most civilizations found themselves neutralized by adaptive shield technologies. Human engineers had studied Zentari weapon systems for years. developing countermeasures that turned their technological superiority into a weakness. Battles in space were no longer about who had the biggest guns. They were about who could think faster. Zentari. Commanders began experiencing something they had never encountered: genuine uncertainty. Their hierarchical decision-making structures collapsed under the weight of unpredictable human strategies. One by one, Zentari ships began to retreat. G1 watched the holographic displays, his expression calm. This wasn't just a military victory. This was a fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. "They're running," his tactical officer remarked. "No," G1 corrected. "They're learning." The final confrontation lasted less than 2 hours. What should have been a simple invasion became a comprehensive defeat. The Zentari fleet, which had conquered hundreds of civilizations, found itself completely outmaneuvered by a coalition they had always considered inferior. Quantum communication networks lit up across multiple star systems. The message was clear. The age of unchallenged Zentari dominance was over. As the last Zentari ships disappeared into hyperspace, something remarkable happened. The Allied fleet didn't celebrate with traditional military displays. Instead, they began sharing technological and cultural information, a true galactic exchange. Humans had done more than win a battle. They had shown the galaxy a new way of existing. The universe watched and learned. Resistance was no longer about fighting. It was about connecting. End of Part 5. Would you like me to provide an epilogue or discuss the story further?